Before I kill myself with my purse, I'm gonna put that there. So what I'm hoping to do in this session is share with you some really recent research that I've done with colleagues on a very negative workplace dynamic. It's called Masculinity, Contest Culture. And I'm gonna share our research findings with you and why it's so problematic. And after that, I'd love to have a few minutes where you share with somebody else in the group to kind of reflect back on things that come into your mind as I'm talking about these kinds of workplace dynamics that take place, and then kind of problem solve things that you feel like have addressed these dynamics and things that you feel like have made them even worse. So what I'm hoping to learn from you all is how this works on the ground, because I study things, but I'm not on the ground inside companies all the time. So it's really these connections between researchers and people in workplaces is super important. So I'm thinking of this as kind of a sharing knowledge session. So the topic is diagnosing and dismantling negative cultures for inclusion. So the last 2 years with the Me Too movement and everything, we've been seeing and reading about a lot of really dysfunctional workplace cultures. And it feels like every week there's a new one. And they share some similar themes, which we're going to go into as well. But the two examples I'm going to start with are from last spring, so about a year ago. And you all may remember this at Nike. The women at Nike felt like they were being mistreated in a variety of ways and sent around an internal survey to kind of characterize what they were experiencing, get a sense of how often it was happening, and then they took that information to the CEO. But this was an expose in the New York Times, and this is the way they started describing where they worked. So this is a quote from the expose. Former employees say culture problems have existed at Nike for years. But in September, back in 2002, the global sports marketing team had several days of meetings in Florida, and on the last night after dinner, a bus carrying a group of several dozen employees pulled up to a strip club. And then this was another quote in the story. There were the staff outings that started at restaurants and ended up at strip clubs, a supervisor who bragged about the condoms he carried in his backpack, a boss who tried to forcibly kiss a female subordinate, and another who referenced a staff member's breasts in an email to her. And then literally in the same month, another story came out in the Seattle Times about Microsoft, and I think one just came out like last week or 2 weeks ago. So this has been an ongoing sort of story there. And this really showed a culture of what I would describe as bullying. And here are some quotes that get at it. The loudest voice in the room gets the attention. And you got brownie points for tearing someone down. If you were the target of the criticism, you'd have to endure a verbal lashing in front of everyone until they were tired of yelling at you. And then the next person got to go. And what I read last week about Microsoft, it's those things plus sexual harassment, women not being promoted, things like that. So a lot of different negative experiences that women were having. And of course, everyone has probably read this now infamous blog post by Susan Fowler, who was on the panel earlier. And in this blog post, she detailed, if you haven't read it, please do, because it's a pretty remarkable summary of her experience. But in the blog post, she talks about the repeated sexual harassment that she experienced from her manager. She talks about her repeated attempts to go to HR, and as she explained at the panel, to go all the way up the chain of leadership to express her concerns and hoping that someone would take action, and no one ever did. And one of the reasons that she was told that nothing was going to happen was because her manager was a top performer. But what's also important to highlight in her blog is that she talks about a lot of other negative dynamics. In fact, she described Uber as a Game of Thrones-like environment in which managers were actively withholding business-critical information from one another in an attempt to sort of actively sabotage their colleagues to kind of one-up and take their role. And so summing it all up, she said that this resulted in business paralysis. And she said it was an organization in complete and unrelenting chaos. Right? So what's a theme to all of these stories that I'll raise right now is usually sexual harassment isn't the only thing that's happening. Usually there's a lot of negative dynamics, bad behavior, dysfunctional dynamics, and that the technical term that we use as sociologists is they co-occur. They're occurring at the same time. So what's going wrong? And this really leaves us, now, we could probably come up with a longer list of stories, and I could keep going on and on. In addition to this, we've also seen, stories at CBS and other companies. And so this raises the important question is, why are companies going off the rails? Like, when this happens, what's going on? And so in research I've been doing with colleagues, we've been looking at something we call masculinity contest culture. So I was a part of a working group for 3 years, and we met several times over the course of 3 years. It was academics from a broad set of fields, so sociology and psychology, law, engineering, to really unpack what we meant by this. But we wrote up our findings in a special journal issue in the Journal of Social Sciences. So I'm going to talk about some of those findings, but then we wrote up kind of a public piece in Harvard Business Review about this dynamic. And really what we focused on are, what happens in these companies and how could it be related to toxic masculinity? We can talk about what I mean by toxic masculinity, but what we learned from our research is that when toxic masculine norms like aggressive competition or the need to dominate others lay at the heart of an organization, really bad things start to happen. And so let's talk about masculinity. Okay. Does anyone want to take a shot at what I mean by masculinity? And feel free to ask questions while I want this to be interactive. So when we talk about masculinity, what does that bring to mind? Aggressiveness. Anyone else?
Well, to me, masculinity is just a set of behaviors and associated more generally with men.
Right.
And some of them are good and some of them are so good.
Yes. A.
The front teacher's pet.
That's right. So masculinity, we often use terms like masculinity a lot, and we all think we know it. And oftentimes people will say like, oh, it's like driving a truck, or it's like lifting weights, or it's drinking beer, or something like that. People can kind of describe it or point to kind of pictures of it, but it's a little bit of a slippery concept. So I like to start out by kind of defining what we're talking about. But it really is a set of behaviors that we associate with men. And there's a lot of phrases that you hear pretty often that kind of point again to masculinity. So things like man up, or boys don't cry, or don't be a little girl. So what's important to understand about masculinity is that it is something that is achieved. Men have to prove their masculinity, and not just once, but over and over and over again. And we know that it's something that as a culture we think of as something that's an achieved status through studies that get at this in very clever ways. So in one study, people were asked to write about a man losing his manhood. Like, give an example of when that happens. And they were all social contexts. People pointed to losing at a fight, right? Losing a fight, or crying in front of other people. Like social situations that somehow undo a man's manhood. But when people were asked to write about a woman losing her womanhood, it was like the inability to have children. Right? It's kind of conflated with biology in a way. So that's how you can kind of get at how we think of masculinity as a culture. So what that reveals is that it's something men have to do, they have to achieve, and they're facing continual pressure, usually, to achieve it. The way we talk about it is that it's a precarious kind of thing, and I'll get there in a second. But it turns out that not only do men have to achieve it, but they very, very easily feel like their masculinity is threatened. So men are put on the defensive even when they're just asked in studies to think about job loss, or they're given some sort of small feedback that they have a more feminine personality. They can react in a very threatened way because they're so focused on proving this masculinity. Many social psychologists have studied this for some time now and looked at it in a lot of different ways, but the conclusion to this long line of research is that masculinity is a precarious thing. is hard won and easily lost. In other words, it actually takes a lot to prove you're a man, but like you can lose it by wearing a pink shirt, right?
I mean, isn't this all purely societal? I mean, that's not really true about masculinity.
Correct, yeah.
Because, I mean, as a butch woman / non-binary person, I don't have any problem with my masculinity. It's never going away. And I don't even have it, really. It's all in my head.
Right.
You know, so, but it's just a thing that's in your head. Why is it such a big deal? I'm sorry.
Yes. We've gotten to part 3 already.
Oh.
Yes. No, you're right. I mean, as you're listening to all of this, it is a really like interesting question. Like, where does it come from? It's such a powerful thing, and it's kind of made up. And what sociologists would say is that it's socially constructed. What's also important to understand about masculinity, even femininity, is that it varies around the world. There are many different forms of masculinity. That's why we typically say masculinities. Like in some cultures, men holding hands is not a big deal at all. In the American context, it remains super problematic, right? So what is a man? What is a boy? What are they allowed to do? But often to prove their masculinity, men behave in ways that conform to our cultural expectations about how men do behave. So being stoic or tough or aggressive or dominant, those kinds of ways. And you can tell there's early on, there can be discomfort with behaving in ways that we don't associate with boys. And I can just tell you, like a personal story is that I took my son, he was 3, he's 8 now, but when he was 3, he really wanted to do a dance class. And I took him to the dance class, and they're sitting all done. He was the only boy. And the first thing this little girl next to him says to the teacher is, "Why is there a boy here?" Right? So we call this gender policing. And it happens in families, it happens at schools, it happens with little kids, which is very early on. So 3-year-olds are already very well aware that dancing for a boy is unusual. Right? So my son got that connection, right? And he might not be able to fully articulate it as you just did about masculinity being a set of behaviors, but what he knew is that he had done something wrong, right? He had crossed a boundary, and he was reminded of that boundary. And that happens over and over and over again, which is how people come to develop a sense of what being a man is. And maybe in this moment in history, depending on where you live and your particular family, the boundaries may be getting a little bit broader. But what most masculinity scholars will still talk about is it's a very narrow box. So boys can't cry, they can't play with dolls. And to the degree that we've seen some variation in what's acceptable, often girls are allowed to behave in a broader set of ways. So it's okay for girls to play with Legos, for example, but it's not okay for boys to play with dolls. So we've seen a lot of movement in terms of what women can do, less movement in what men are able to do. Which I think is a big part of why we continue to see these problems. So if you think about it, if you're experiencing a lot of pressure to prove your manhood, and it's something you have to do repeatedly, how might you behave towards other people? If you needed to be aggressive and dominant, what might you do at work, for example?
Speak louder, raise your voice.
Raise your voice. Interrupt.
Take up more physical space.
Take up more space. Exactly, these kinds of things, right? You might yell at people publicly and belittle them. You might try to one-up and sabotage your manager or your colleague. You might sexually harass women to show them who's boss, right? And we actually have some evidence to suggest that often sexual harassment is taking place when men feel their power is going down. So there's some sort of kind of macro data showing that when men's their rates of employment go up at like an aggregate level, there's more reports of sexual harassment, right? So it's an interesting relationship. But in any case, if you think about masculinity as it's primarily about being dominant over other people. And so we're at work, right? Work becomes a site where you can have power, influence, control. So work becomes a central site where this masculinity contest plays out. And I think as we're talking, you're going to have memories of different dynamics you've seen that may really reflect this larger its larger context. But the result is that proving masculinity becomes can lead to these kinds of behaviors: sexual harassment, bullying, sort of a dog-eat-dog kind of culture, which I'm going to talk about more, winner-take-all, other kinds of unethical behaviors that flow from this toxic masculinity. So masculinity means a lot of things that we've kind of talked about in different ways, but one is showing no weakness, right? You can't be vulnerable at all. If you are the dominant person and you are in control, then you show no weakness. Putting work above all else. Culturally, men being in that provider role remains very, very common and pervasive, so it's putting work above everything else. Taking unwarranted risks to show that you're not afraid and that you're not vulnerable. Bullying, sexually harassing others, being stronger and possessing greater work stamina. We'll talk about this because I think that happens a lot in tech. Withholding information to get ahead and then excluding others. Sort of like you're on the winning team or on the losing team. So these are sort of ways we might think about what masculinity means, and this is not an exhaustive list. We could keep going. And again, to be clear, this can change depending on the context you're in, the company you're in even, or the part of the world that you're in. Come on. Okay. So with my colleagues, we looked at 4 primary ways that men may prove manhood at work. So really what we did is create a hypothesis. We're like, okay, we know that men have to prove their masculinity, right? We know they probably are doing it at work because it's a place where you can get control over other people and you can get power and influence. What might be the ways it's showing up at work? So my colleagues created 4 different ways of looking at it, and then they sent out this survey to almost 1,000 people in different in Canada and the United States, and asking questions about the first dimension, which is show no weakness. So this is, again, not showing vulnerability, showing only pride or anger. And an example of this is never admitting any doubts, never admitting that you don't know, and showing no empathy at all, and bragging, these kinds of maybe even close to arrogance. The second one was, again, this put work first kind of dynamic, being a breadwinner, not a caregiver. Examples of how this might show up at work is working really long hours, emailing back right away. You've all been on those weird threads. And never taking leave, right? That it's like really frowned upon, or you feel like companies have these policies, but no one uses them, like, working from home or whatever, because they're so worried they're going to be perceived as not committed to their work. The third one, strength and stamina, be stronger, last longer. And again, this can show up differently in different environments. In some places, like being a jock is really important, or I've seen some cultures where like extreme sports are really common and kind of interesting. Or people coding for days at a time, or having a crushing handshake. That might be how it shows up. Yeah.
Survey only for men, or?
No, it was for everyone to rate their company or their employer on these dimensions. So like, how common are these kinds? These are not a comprehensive list of everything that was asked. It's just the themes that were explored.
But this can apply for women as well.
Oh, correct. Yes. Part 2 is coming. And then the final one is this dog-eat-dog dynamic, being king of the hill, being ruthless, trust no one, completely crush competitors, those kinds of dynamics. So within each of these, we had a few questions to ask people to rate where they work on these dimensions. And then there were a whole other set of, the scales were actually quite long, about psychological safety, toxic leadership, sexual harassment, ethnic harassment, sexist climate. It was a very long, involved survey. And this is the way it ended up. We actually had our lab had a corporate partner meeting, and we had a kitchen cabinet, which we met in advance of this meeting. So I ran the meeting, and this was like, I guess almost a year ago now, where we talked about this masculinity contest culture, and we met with a pre-meeting group, and this is how, and I talked to them about what this masculinity contest culture, and these were some of the quotes that we heard from people when they were hearing about our research. And so one person said, it's about loudership, right? It's like the loudest voice in the room gets, I'm seeing smiles. This is so interesting to give this talk because people like smile and nod. And I also joke that I should have a therapist too, because some of it is really like really triggering in a lot of ways of crazy things we've all seen. He lacks gravitas. He's a physically small guy. So men too can be on the outside of the masculinity contest, depending on how they present themselves or how they are. It's not okay to show you're wobbling. It's about, I have a backbone, I'm right. Those are the people who are put up for promotion. You can see a company valuing this kind of no hesitation. Or this other quote, it's all about hyper competition and mine is bigger than yours. And it all plays around who is the bigger hero in saving and keeping the customer. And what's important to understand is that while these 4 dimensions are important, some dimensions may be more salient, so to speak, in some organizations than others, and it may show how it shows up may be different. So it's not that you have to check the box on all of these for your company or your group to have a masculinity contest culture. It may look a little bit different, but there's a similar theme and a similar flavor to it. So what's important to understand here is that the coin of the realm might change. In other words, what's most prized in an organization or a group might shift from one group to the other. Again, some groups may be really obsessed with like exercise and triathlons, and some groups might be really obsessed with like coding for 3 days straight. But it's the same thing about being invulnerable, being physically tough, those kinds of dynamics. That's what helps you see whether or not you're in a masculinity contest. So what's important also to understand is that an organization can be said to have a masculinity contest culture when this isn't just the isolated behavior of a few people, but this is the way work gets done. Right? So whenever you start at a new organization, you kind of see, oh, that's interesting that they do things that way or that way. This is the way work gets done, all in these kinds of negative ways, actually. So part 2 then becomes, a lot of times people hear this, they're like, but I've seen women behave this way as well. Right? So I don't want to conflate it just with what men may do to prove masculinity. And the reason this is all happening is that everyone has to play the game. I think this is the game that's set. It's a masculinity contest. Everyone in the organization or on the team has to either adapt to it or play the game or stay on the sidelines. But what can happen for women and other underrepresented groups or men who don't fit the mold is that they're sort of hamstrung in their ability to play the game. So the way this manifests for women, often people of color, is that if women behave in the ways that sort of enable you to win, if they're forceful, if they're angry, if they self-promote, if they try to crush the competition, they can get pushed back for kind of behaving in too dominant a way. In general, women are expected to be nice and friendly and warm and nurturing. This is a gender stereotype we have, all of us, in our culture. And so when women behave in these more dominant and aggressive ways, they face pushback for doing that, often in the form of being told that they're too abrasive, they're too aggressive, they're too selfish out for themselves. It can come up in performance reviews where their personality gets talked about more so than their performance. So women can play the game too, but when they play it, they're going to face pushback for using the same kinds of strategies and tools that other men may use. Same thing for people of color. There's the angry black woman stereotype, the angry black man stereotype. So that can impact an individual person's ability to play in this game. And then men who don't fit the mold. We've actually had some of my colleagues are in the audience where men are in performance reviews. They're too quiet. Right? They're too introverted, and they get dinged for that. So men who are maybe on that kind of quieter side in terms of their personality or their manner can also be hamstrung in this game, which makes it really hard. So these were other quotes that we collected. Women here go along to get along. They don't want to be blamed for efforts to change things. This happens with women a lot. There's a perception that women help each other, but many don't. And I'm going to get into why they don't in a second. And it's particularly hard here for introverted men. They associate these behaviors with leadership, and they feel they don't have access to advancement. They really struggle here, right? So in a company, if you think of like maybe the prototypical masculinity contest culture, which I would describe as Uber at the time Susan Fowler wrote that blog post, if what's going to get you promoted is being this sort of person where you're very dominant, very aggressive, and very cutthroat, anyone of any gender or any race who doesn't fit that model is going to be left behind. And therefore, a lot of people adapt to play the game, right? And we can understand why they would if they want to get promoted. So MCC is the acronym for Masculinity Contest Culture. And it can lead to what we call social distancing. So women who win the contest tend to distance themselves from other women. This is sort of broadly referred to as queen bee behaviors. So what happens is, I don't think I've ever given a talk where someone hasn't asked me something along the lines of, the worst boss I've ever had was a woman, or the person who most undermined me was a woman, or women are their own worst enemy. So I'm very well versed in answering this question because I've gotten it so much now, but it really speaks to the MCC as well. So what happens is for women for whom being a woman is not like the strongest part of their identity, there's just like, they want to just be an engineer or whatever, they don't want to be a woman engineer, which I think a lot of us can relate to. Along the way, they realize that being a woman is a liability. Right? They begin to see that women have less social value in most organizations than do men and in society at large. So really kind of promoting the fact and emphasizing the fact that they're a woman is probably not the most viable strategy when they're just looking at their own individual ability to advance. And so what some people will do is start to distance themselves from other women. It's called the way we talk about it in social psychology is social distancing. They'll say, I'm not like other women, I've always been committed to my career. Or I'm more like a guy. Or I'm not like other women, I'm not emotional at all. So this kind of distancing of other women. And then if you don't want to associate with women, you're going to avoid sponsoring women, you're not going to join the women's network. In the most extreme forms, it can lead to queen bee behaviors of actively undermining other women colleagues. But usually when we see the queen bee behaviors, the people who show these behaviors are women for whom being a woman is not a central part of their identity, and for whom they've been on the receiving end of gender bias. So that's the way that they're trying to navigate a really unfair system. And it's not just women who do it. Many people in marginalized groups will behave in these ways too. So there's some new lines of research on immigrants in certain countries distancing themselves from their immigrant group because, again, being an immigrant of that group is a liability. It's an individual mobility strategy within like a system of inequality, if that makes sense. So it's not just that women have like a catty gene or women are just mean. It's actually the way individuals respond in an unequal system, which is like, why would I like get really close to the other marginalized people? And so there's a certain rationale to it. Interestingly, women for whom being a woman is a central part of their identity, when they experience gender bias, they respond by wanting to kind of help other women and secure more opportunities for women. So it's sort of a two-part thing there. So of course, and especially in an environment that's high on the masculinity contest culture, being a woman is not something you're going to want to like really amp up. So that's why we believe we see these kinds of social distancing behaviors. So how they've succeeded in the masculinity contest thus far, most women, by distancing themselves from other women, and then it's a way to maintain their kind of power and influence and ability to continue to advance in this context. So they really experience, as my colleagues say, strong incentives to disidentify as a woman, to kind of minimize and de-emphasize those parts of themselves. So then what happens in companies with masculinity contest culture? So again, we sent this survey out, about 1,000 people took it, and when they rated their company higher on these measures, they also rated it higher on these kinds of things. So these are at the organizational level. They were more likely to report having toxic leaders, more likely to experience bullying and harassment, a lack of managerial support for work-family things, low levels of psychological safety, sexist climate, and few women in management. So things that seem kind of different sometimes, like at Uber, there was sexual harassment, and then there was also this Game of Thrones-like environment, are actually all part of a more dysfunctional culture, if you will, a negative culture that had a lot of implications, not just sexual harassment. And then the negative individual outcomes were job dissatisfaction, burnout, higher turnover intentions, low organizational dedication, that's like wanting to stay late and at work, those kinds of measures, poor mental and physical health, and people rated their performance as worse. So as a framework, this is one of the most explanatory frameworks I've ever worked on. Usually you study something and it accounts for like this much of what you see and it's still an important finding. This concept is really accounting for so many things that people experience that get in the way of diversity and particularly inclusion, right? Feeling like you belong. So it's an interesting and almost comprehensive explanation for a lot of the different things that we see on the ground inside companies. And it can also be the case that some groups or divisions in a company are more like this than other parts. That's the other hard part about when you're kind of trying to diagnose where this is most problematic. It might be that some groups are okay, but other groups have a real problem. So there's a lot of negative business implications to this. I think what's hard is that this way of being in the masculinity contest is kind of equated with being successful, right? If you engage in all these behaviors and you prove your masculinity and you're successful, it's seen as a positive outcome. But as we can see with Uber and other companies, there's huge business risk to having these kinds of environments. So there's legal risks and obviously the expenses associated with it. There's the threat to the company and the brand image, the reputational damage. This can lead to very real problems with recruiting, hiring, developing, all of those things. But it also reduces like just the kind of innovation process, right? So in order for people to be creative and to innovate, they have to feel safe, right? Feeling like always on edge, like the next shoe is about to drop is not going to produce the best work results among most people. So it undermines psychological safety, which then all other kinds of things happen. But if you can just play out, colleagues withholding business critical information from each other, people leaving like Susan Fowler did, so you're losing talent. You're particularly probably losing women and people of color at higher rates. Not as much flexibility, and then increased resistance to organizational design and process improvements. Because if you have that kind of core group of people who've won in the masculinity contest, they can be very resistant to changing it, right? So you almost the problem gets intensified, and then lower individual productivity. So all of these things put an organization's effectiveness and reputation at risk, and many also put them at legal risk, particularly in the Me Too era. And what's also interesting to note is that these cultures are almost universally disliked by men and women. But the game plays on. And the question is, why would it play on? If people don't like it, if it's leading to all kinds of negative outcomes, then why does it persist? And it persists for a few reasons. The first is that one of my colleagues did a study that looked at how people, do they endorse these kinds of dynamics, and then how do they think their coworkers, are their coworkers supportive of these dynamics? What most people tend to think is that while they don't like them, they think their coworkers support them. So they have almost a misperception. Everyone is self-reporting that they don't like them, and everyone's reporting that their colleagues do support them. So there's a mismatch. But if you think that you're kind of the only one who doesn't like it, you're less likely to speak up. So part of why the game plays on is very few people speak up about it and push back, particularly on things like FaceTime at the office or things like that. It can be very hard to raise a concern on that issue. The second thing is that subordinates often lack the power to speak up. During the panel and the talk this morning, the dare to ask questions, dare to ask why, and all of those things are really important. I think we're living through a historical moment of people speaking up more, but often people in subordinate roles don't speak up because they can't. Right? So that's the other problem, is people either think their coworkers are already on board, or they're fearful for speaking up, to speak up. They might lose their job or face other kind of pushback. And then senior leaders have little incentive to change, often because they're the winners of the masculinity contest. So the game plays on. So real significant change actually requires shutting down the game. And so how do we think about doing that? We can think about what senior leaders need to do. So in terms of getting ahead of this or stopping this, like most things, senior leaders play a really important role, again, as was discussed at the panel. Leaders need to fully understand the business costs, and it's not just the cost of a legal case about sexual harassment. You can see with the example of Uber how systemic those consequences were in terms of the reputational damage that the company experienced. And I know they've done a lot to change things, but I'm sure in general a lot of women in particular are hesitant to work at a company that has had that kind of history. So not to mention the negative impact it can have on innovation and creativity, which are central. So what leaders then need to do is focus on creating a set of values and norms about a civil and respectful workplace. This seems kind of easy, but there's actually very few company-produced guidelines on what professional behavior looks like. To the degree that we have guidelines, it's mostly guidelines on what not to do, which is also important. But there's much less actual articulation of what does professional and respectful and civil behavior look like. So there's kind of that thought work and analytical work in creating a clear set of guidelines, both what to do and what not to do, and then sharing those. And of course, senior leaders need to model them as well. And they need to monitor and measure the impact. And as companies do this, they will get information back. As I'm sure anytime you roll out an initiative, you get a lot of feedback. And so then you can iterate from there. In practice, what this looks like is instead of focusing on masculinity, focusing on mission, right? What we're all trying to achieve, not what you individually are out to get or win or conquer, but having the company focus on mission. And so that can mean, for example, thinking through everything from guidelines of professionalism to even compensation. Because it may be that you have a compensation system that actually is rewarding these individual winner-take-all dynamics, instead of having compensation that's organized at a more team level or a collective level, or any other kind of like organizational reward that's valuing individual achievement over the group. So really changing incentives to match a focus on mission. What this also means is moving away from the brilliant jerk and rewarding the brilliant jerk. Remember, Arianna Huffington was like, these are just brilliant jerks. And instead really celebrating the kind innovator. Right? It's rewarding the behavior that you want to see. And time again, I've said to, when I'm giving talks or I'm doing some consulting work, I'm like, don't do all of this if you're just going to promote the jerk in the end. Don't spend the time creating the guidelines. Don't revalue or overhaul your compensation system. Don't spend all that time if in the end, the person who mistreats other people is the one who's going to get the promotion. Because you're not walking the walk and talking the talk, right? So the actual commitment then is to not just do the work of rethinking how to change a culture or move a culture in another direction, but it's actually following through on it. And it's moving away from a dive and save sort of mentality that you're always in a fire drill and moving more towards this judicious planning and project management. Many, many years ago now, I did a study of fathers who work in high tech, and they would talk about it, and it ended up being about masculinity. I went into the field not thinking about masculinity at all, but the way they started talking about things like one dad said to me, well, in engineering, it's not like being like more brave than your fellow firefighter and going up one more flight of stairs. It's how much code can you write? How long can you stay up? When people order pizza to the office late at night, that's what gets rewarded and valued. And he's like, a project becomes lore when the engineering team worked 3 days straight to get it out the door. And I said to him, or it's just poor planning. Right? Like you can really reframe it. And if you have a dive and save culture or kind of a fire drill culture, everyone can get rewarded for working these crazy hours or being up all night or responding to emails at midnight and all that stuff. If you have a culture that's more about planning and project management, then that would be critiqued, right? The engineers having to work 3 days straight would not be seen as a success. It would not become lore. It would not be about men proving their manhood, which no one actually says, but is sort of what is part of it all. It would be a problem to be solved because no one should work like that, and we should be planning better. So it's really moving from one lens to another. Yeah.
On those lines, have you studied the waterfall model and the child?
I don't think so.
Because, I mean, I've been in the industry for a while, and I remember thinking that doing things like you do, but you have no planning skills at all.
Right.
The culture has changed, and I wonder what came first.
Mm.
What drove the change in process? I mean, I haven't thought of it until you mentioned it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But now, if you don't do HR,
Mm-hmm.
you are declared found safe.
Mm-hmm.
And you can go off and do whatever you want. That's like, before you even get started, people tell you that is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you plan too much, you will get nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
So then,
Yeah, so how do you navigate that?
yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll have you all problem solve that because that feels really hard. So I think what is important to when you're dealing with these culture issues is asking people to unpack their assumptions and the lens they're bringing into it, which is there may be some amount of uncertainty in the marketplace or on a project that's just real in there, but it doesn't mean that everybody else has to have complete uncertainty in what they're doing and how they're doing it. And to look at that, like your point, the waterfall of how that would play out in people's lives. And then it's kind of raising that perspective and not just, people say a lot of things and think a lot of things without unpacking what the impact would be on employees, on teams, and on innovation over the long term. So it's kind of getting people to, in a nice way, asking them to really unpack their assumptions about how they think work should get done. But that's also an organizational question that people should be thinking about. So this is just the way culture change would work, and we can talk about it a little bit more. I have another slide here. So for dismantling a masculinity contest culture, one would be to move from the sort of anxiety, fear-based model to one where psychological safety is important. That's where people feel like they can make mistakes, they can take risks, they can learn. The second one is a zero tolerance or about bullying, mistreatment, toxic leadership, sexual harassment. Again, you have to actually walk the walk and talk the talk. You can't say that we don't tolerate these behaviors and then not have consequences when people engage in those kinds of behaviors. Clear consequences are really important as well. So I sometimes wonder, most companies have a sexual harassment policy, but if you were to ask the average employee, I'm not sure the average employee would just know what it is and what to do to report it and what the consequences are. So being really clear about communicating what those things are. And finally, prioritizing diversity. When more leaders are women and more leaders look like a bunch of different walks of life, they tend to tamp down these hyper-masculine kinds of environments. So we know rates of sexual harassment go up in male-dominated environments, and they go down when there are more women. So really thinking about it as a strategy to create not only to create a fair system and make sure the best talent gets to the top, but that it can fundamentally alter the culture of a company as well. The final point I'll make, though, about this whole problem before we kind of talk and have Q&A is that what we're really up against is a deep-seated cultural problem in which toxic masculinity and many aspects of it are still valorized in our society, are still desired in men, are still expected of boys. And so all of this is the deep cultural work to undo what we think masculinity is or can be or should be. I do think we're in the middle of that, but it takes some deeper conversations about, is not about being a real man, it's about being a good man, right? It's about conversations where you can say it's okay for boys to cry. It's okay for them to play with dolls. It's important conversations about consent and all other kinds of things. So that's sort of the sidecar to organizational change, is that we're still grappling as a culture with what we mean by masculinity and what it should mean and what it is. And these kinds of conversations sometimes can be even harder to have, because people are often very tied to maybe more traditional notions of masculinity, but there's increasing, I think, understanding that toxic masculinity has a lot of negative outcomes related to all kinds of things, but, physical harm and drug abuse and substance abuse and other things. When people can't express their emotions, they will, cope in other ways. So that's what we're up against as a culture. And with that, what I'm hoping you all can do, I saw a lot of nodding, and I'm probably reminding you of many different instances and conversations you've had or things you've seen. How much time do we have left? So we have about 15 minutes? 13, you're very precise. With our 13 minutes left, what I'm hoping is if you could maybe pair up and for 5 minutes talk about something that came to mind for you related to this discussion. And what I'm really seeking is hearing about things that helped address the dynamic or things that made it worse. So things that can kind of make it exacerbate it or reduce the dynamic, so that's phase 2 of my research. Okay, so I'll give you all 5 minutes to kind of pair up if you can. Looks like there are enough. All right, so we only have about 5 minutes left with each other. So, we're not sure what happened, but I was on my last slide anyway. So the timing worked out. So I'd love to hear then, any questions you all have, but I'd love examples of we'll start.
Okay, well, an example.
Yeah.
I've been using Deborah Tannen's old work, communication between men and women for years. Yeah. And there's an exercise I created, actually an engineering culture, an engineering group asked me to develop the exercise about devil's advocate. And because devil's advocate so permeates engineering culture and many other cultures. And it really, for many women, it's an experience, and underrepresented groups, it's an experience of being shot down. Yeah. And so this engineering group saw this video and said, could you do an exercise about this? And what we did was created angels advocates and have it, because often more relational people like to build ideas rather than poke holes in it. Right. And just for them to get, for the men to get that there's a different way to think about it and actually have an experience of the innovation that comes out of it. Right. And they do. I've had engineers who've been working together, solve a problem that they haven't been able to solve before, just by shifting to play angels advocate. Yeah, that's great. So that's a crack in the cosmic egg. And, we can do more, but I know you want to ask other people. Yeah, no, that's great. That's, I think there's a lot of very combative cultures out there, particularly in technical or scientific communities, where it's a lot of pounding on the table that can be off-putting to a lot of people. So that's a great example. Anyone else?
You get some of us older women. Yes, here. So we at HP back in the day created the very first technical women's conference in the industry, and then went out and taught other women about that. And we came off of, again, another old book, Roosevelt Lost Cancer's Men and Women of the Corporation. And in her appendix, she has a graph about relative numbers of one's own kind. And when you are statistically a token, not psychologically, statistically, when fewer than 10% are like you, you're a token. And tokens burn out. Tokens have no power. They don't have a voice. When I was one of 2 women in a group of 20 men, they called us both the same name because tokens all look alike. So we would get together at the end of the day and trade messages. Okay? So the thing is, when you're a token, the job is to become a minority. And the only way to do that is to organize. Okay? So we organized. It's Technical Women's Conference. Then we had lots of opportunities for men to have the experience of the speaker on the stage this morning of looking out. People not like me and getting the experience. But it was interesting when we filled out the application to win the Catalyst Award, which is like this premier award for advancing women in technology, or anywhere, I guess. We had to call in 10 times to figure out how to apply for the award because it was only set up to award individual behavior, right? So how do you even describe it when the form is set up? So they gave the award to our CEO because that's the only thing we could figure out to do. And then when he got up to give his keynote and they had, given him a half an hour to talk about what he did, he said, I got out of the way. And he sat down, right? But if you organize, you can amplify your own voice, right? And when you go in and say, as a woman in women in engineering at VMware or wherever, right? They don't know how many there are, and their fantasy is worse than the reality. Powerful that organize, and all it takes is meet at the lunch table at the same time for a half an hour, and call yourself something. Get a web page in the company directory, and you're on.
Yeah. So I think, thanks for calling me. This event here, this event right here is a way that we can move things forward. And as well, I mean, as I alluded to before, societally, so, in my opinion, society is what is causing our problem with masculinity because we have toxic masculinity in our society. It's part of the whole framework, in my opinion, of white supremacy and white male leadership culture. And you can see it right now in the worst possible way at the very top of our political structure, where they're all stabbing each other in the back and doing all of those behaviors. You can see them in the White House and in the cabinet today. The way to get out of that, in my opinion, dismantle all that stuff.
All right. I like our radical direction. This is getting radical. Any other examples or ideas or questions you have about what to do? We only have 1 minute, and this is actually a pretty broad topic, and it is linked with other forms of power and domination and hierarchy. So, maybe not something we can solve in an hour together, if only. But I do think events like today matter, and connections among you all matter. So if there's anything you take away from this, it's that I hope I've given you a name for a lot of the dynamics that you see, a framework to start thinking about it, and ways to maybe start solving it at the individual level, but organizing with other people. And asking your organizations to sort of create some specific guidelines and to think through the patterns of behavior and how those guidelines can maybe push back on that behavior. So with that, and I can be here for a little bit too if you have some one-on-one questions that you want to ask. All right, great.